Okay, thanks. I'm Tom Christensen. I'm the director of the Columbia University China and the World program here at CEPA. This is our penultimate event of the semester. We have an event next Monday as well with another fellow, Wang Xiaonan, and I encourage people to come to that event on Monday, December 12th at 4:30 at the same time as today. Today we have special guests. All of our fellows are special, and today we have a fellow in the program for 2022 to 2023. He is Chengzhi Yin, and Chengzhi Yin came to us from Boston College, and his intellectual history is pretty much the intellectual history of the China and the World program, which was started to try to encourage people to blend international relations theory with the study of China's foreign relations in a way that would appeal to academic audiences, to students, and to faculty. And Chengzhi Yin studied at Boston College for his PhD with Robert Ross, an old friend of our program, who's an eminent China scholar at China's foreign relations, and with Timothy Crawford, who is a real star in IR theory, working on alliances. So it may come as no surprise that Chengzhi Yin wrote a very good dissertation on China's alliance balancing strategy called Logic of Choice. And today he's going to talk about China's efforts to drive wedges in alliances of adversaries or potential adversaries around the PRC, and also China's efforts to bind allies and partners to the PRC so as to strengthen China's security position in the international environment. So very much looking forward to this session. And I'm going to turn it over to Chengzhi, who's going to stand with this microphone here, and I'm going to move off to the side. We have people in the room and we have people online. The people online can send their questions in the Q&A function. Is that correct, Daniel? Correct. And Daniel Sahensky will field those questions, and then we have the people in the room to ask questions. But welcome, Chengzhi, and I'll turn it over to you, and I'll hand you the microphone, and you can take it with you.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And I'm gonna steal the microphone from you and stand up right here. Let's see. Okay. Me my slides on the show. Okay, thank you, and thanks, Tom, for the warm introduction. So I'm a postdoc in the China and the World program, and today I'm very happy to talk about China's alliance balancing strategies. It's the book project that I'm working on. So for today's plan, I plan to talk for about half an hour, and it will be divided into two parts. In the first part, I will discuss the theory about how China chooses its alliance balancing strategies. And in the second part of the talk, I will try to use two Korean cases to illustrate the theory. So let's jump to the business. So first, a little motivation for this book project. That is the principle of divide and conquer as a very old political wisdom, but it's still relevant in today's great power competition. So I will give you two recent examples. The first one is the annual threat assessment published by the US Defense Department every year. So this is the most recent one published in 2022. And in it, it says that China will work to undercut US influence and drive wedges between Washington and its partners. So China is trying to drive the United States away from its allies. So is Russia, not surprisingly. So in a report released by NATO last year, it says that Russia is creating a wedge between NATO and its partner nations in Europe. And even after the war in Ukraine broke out, some NATO officials still argue that Russia is trying very hard to separate Poland from the rest of Europe. So both China and Russia are trying to drive wedges between the United States and its allies. So naturally, the United States would want to take measures to counter those efforts. And I'm going to argue that all those policies, so China's and Russia's dividing efforts and the US countermeasures are all examples of alliance balancing strategies. So it's important for us to try to figure out how great powers choose the alliance balancing strategies. And in this project, I explore this question by asking, how does China, as one of the great powers, choose its alliance balancing strategies? So before we move forward, the definition of alliance balancing strategy, right? So in this project, it's defined as a state's measures to divide adversarial alignments and maintain its own alignments. So there are 2 points that I want to emphasize in this definition. So first, alliance balancing strategies involve 2 different scenarios. One is dividing and the other is maintaining. So they are basically 2 sides of one coin, just the flipping the other coin. And the second point I want to emphasize is that alliances are a subset of alignments. So with this definition in this project, we can explore both alliances and security cooperation between countries without alliance agreements. So it can take a look at more cases. So that's the puzzle. And now it's time to set up the other theory. So as I just mentioned, when China uses its alliance balancing strategies, it happens in 2 different scenarios. The first is a wedging scenario in which China tries to divide hostile alliances. So here we have 3 different actors. We have China, who chooses alliance balancing strategies. We have the adversary, a great power that opposes threat to China's security. And we have the target state, the target of China's alliance balancing strategies. So the target may or may not pose a threat to China's security, but because the target has an alignment with the adversary, so the target contributes to the adversary's threat to China because this alignment increases the aggregated capabilities of the adversary's camp. Okay? So that's the first scenario. Now let's move to the second scenario and let's flip the situation. So the second scenario is a binding scenario. Okay? So in this situation, China tries to maintain its alignments with the target state. So we have the same 3 actors, but in this dynamic, the positions of the adversary and China are changed. Okay? So in this scenario, the adversary tries to drive a wedge, tries to drive a wedge between China and the target state. And in this scenario, the target and China are in an alignment. So the adversary's dividing efforts poses a threat again to China's security. Therefore, China wants to use alliance balancing strategies to counter that effort to maintain its alignments with the target. So those are 2 scenarios in which China needs to choose alliance balancing strategies. Now let's move to variables in the theory. So I propose 2 independent variables in the theory to explain China's choices of alliance balancing strategies. So the first variable is China's leverage over the target state. It measures the vulnerability of the target states to China's influence in terms of their foreign policy making. And the second variable is the threat perception. It's the that's the threat that China perceives from the nature of the relationship between the adversary and the target state. And in wedging and binding scenarios, China will face different sources of threat perceptions. I will explain that later in the theory section. And now, the dependent variable of this research is different types of alliance balancing strategies. And they are basically 3 different types. The first one is accommodation. It's to use actual or promised rewards to change the target state's alignment decision. And the second type of alliance balancing strategy as coercion, that is to use actual or threatened punishments to change the target state's alignment decision. And the final type of alliance balancing strategies is just to wait and see. It's basically requires China to keep the existing course of action towards the target state. And the point I want to emphasize here regarding the dependent variable is that accommodation and coercion are not mutually exclusive, okay? Because they are basically two aspects of selective and conditional self-commitments. And as we will see, China can and will choose a mix of both accommodation and coercion. Okay? So that's the setup of the theory. And now let's move to the actual argument. So again, first, let's consider the wedging scenario in which China considers its alliance balancing strategies. So to quickly recap, in a wedging scenario, China needs to drive a wedge to divide hostile alignments between the target and the adversary. Okay? So when China considers its strategies, it starts with its leverage over the target state. If China has strong leverage over the target state, it would choose to accommodate the target. And the reason is because of China's concern for the risk of balancing blowback, the risk that coercion would unite the target state and the adversary rather than dividing them. So it's because if China chooses coercion, then by definition, China poses some threat to the target state, and that would give the target state some incentives to cooperate closely with the adversary rather than stop cooperating with the adversary. But that's not the complete picture, because in this situation, China would also want to use coercion as its complementary strategy. Because if China chooses to accommodate the target state, then it would be in the target's interests to invite a bidding war between China and the adversary over the target state's loyalty. So China would want to use coercion to send a signal to the target state that China is not interested in entering such a bidding war. So that will become the combination of strategies that China chooses. Now, if China only has weak leverage, then it would need to consider its threat perception. And in a wedging scenario, this China's threat perception largely comes from the security cooperation between the target state and the adversary. If such security cooperation has reached a very high level, it means China probably would perceive a serious threat from the alignment between target and the adversary. And because China doesn't have strong leverage, then China would have to use coercion as its primary strategy to divide that alignment. But again, that's not the complete picture, because in this situation, China would want to use accommodation as its complementary strategy. It's because for every coercive policy, it has to have some assurance component in that coercion. And using accommodation as a complementary strategy would help China to increase the credibility of that assurance component in its coercion. So that would be the combination of strategies that China chooses. And then if China doesn't perceive a serious threat from that alignment, and China doesn't have a strong leverage, then China could just wait and see what will happen and then make decisions later. So that's the wedging scenario. And now let's move to the binding scenario. And I'm going to argue that we will use the same two independent variables to explain China's choices of strategies, but the same two independent variables will lead to distinct choices of strategies. So to quickly recap, in a binding scenario, the adversary tries to drive a wedge between the target and China wants to use alliance balancing strategies to counter that dividing efforts from the adversary. So again, in the first step, China starts with the consideration of its leverage over the target state. But here, if China has strong leverage over the target state, then China would choose coercion against the target state. It's because China still worries about the risk of balancing blowback. But here in a binding scenario, because the target and China are already in alignment, it means if China has strong leverage over the target, it means the target's security heavily relies on China. If that's the case, then the risk of balancing blowback is pretty low. And if that's the case, China's coercion is likely to work. And when coercion is likely to work, it tends to be cheaper because China doesn't need to carry out its threats in the real world. And then, so China will use coercion against the target state. And the same logic that we mentioned in the wedging scenario will apply here. China would want to use accommodation as its complementary strategy to increase the credibility of the assurance component within China's coercion. And then if China doesn't have strong leverage over the target states, then it will consider its threat perception. And in a binding scenario, if China perceives serious threat, that means that the likelihood of the target state abandoning China is pretty high, and the risk of such abandonment is pretty serious for China's security. If that's the case, then China would have to use accommodation to induce the target state to stay within the alignment with China. And again, just as we mentioned in the wedging scenario, in this situation, China still wants to use coercion as its complementary strategy to send a signal that China doesn't want to enter a bidding war with the adversary over the target's loyalty. And then again, if China doesn't perceive a serious threat and China only has weak leverage, then China could just simply wait and to see what will happen and then make a decision later. So that's the dry part of this presentation. And now let's move to the fun part. So I will talk about two Korea cases to illustrate this abstract theoretical argument. So the first case is a binding scenario where China tried to keep North Korea loyal between 1965 and 1970. So in this case, the Soviet Union tried to drive a wedge between North Korea and China. And in this period, North Korea and China were allies. Okay. So a little background to this case. After Brezhnev took office, the Soviet Union started to drive a wedge between China and North Korea. So the Soviet Union increased its economic and military assistance to North Korea, and the Soviet Union publicly lent more and more political support for the North Korean regime. And as a result, North Korea was induced away from China, and North Korea decided to tilt towards the Soviet Union. And let me remind you that in that period, the Soviet Union was a major source of threat to China's security. So China would definitely not want this North Korea drifting away to happen. So as a result, China needed to consider its options. And as the theory argues, China would start with its leverage. And I would argue that in this case, China had strong leverage that largely came from geography, or more specifically, largely came from the geographic reality that China and North Korea had this very long border shown on the map. Okay? Oh, it's important to North Korea because in the late 1960s, North Korea faced a serious threat from South Korea and the United States, and China being there could serve as a role of a sanctuary for North Korean troops and logistics in a war in the future. And China being there could serve as a powerful deterrent against South Korea and the United States. And China being there means it could be convenient for China to exert pressure on North Korea if necessary. And also, the Soviet Union and North Korea only had a tiny border, means that it's difficult for the Soviet Union to provide a substitute with North Korea for China's geographic advantage. And the North Koreans recognized that. So in 1967, Kim Il-sung told the Soviet ambassador that we, North Korea, have a small border with the Soviet Union, but a very long one with China. And that is a serious question for North Korea. So China had a strong leverage. Then, as the theory predicts, the primary strategy that China chose was coercive. Okay? So first, China publicly and explicitly warned North Korea against standing close with the Soviet Union. So on different occasions, Chinese diplomats and even Chengzhi, the Chinese foreign minister, publicly told the North Koreans that you should keep your distance with modern revisionists. So that's the Soviets. And then in this period, China reduced its economic assistance and trade with North Korea. So China reduced and even stopped the supply of coking coal, minerals, steel products, all those materials that were vital to North Korea's economy. So that again increased the costs for North Korea to stay close with the Soviet Union. And then more interestingly, China also raised the tension along the border between China and North Korea. It's a satellite taken from the CIA inventory, and it doesn't have a high resolution, but if you zoom in enough, you can see this is the border between China and North Korea. And here, China were constructing some trenches with firing positions. So China, by doing so, China increased some pressure on North Korea. And the North Koreans complained to the Soviets and to East German guests that there was a time when North Korea had more problems on its border with China than along the 38th parallel. So China seriously posed some threats against North Korea in this period. So its case basically fits the theory that I just described. So but that's not the whole story, right? Because China in the late 1960s also used accommodation as its complementary strategy. So in the late 1960s, China never stopped its military assistance to North Korea. So China continued to supply rice as war materials, and China continued to supply military hardware and diesel oil for North Korean aircraft. At the same time, China also reconfirmed its security commitments to North Korea. So on different occasions, the Chinese leaders told the North Koreans that if the United States would invade North Korea, China would definitely stand with North Korea and fight the Americans. So that was serious and important to North Korea in terms of their security. So that's the North Korea case. And let's move to a more recent case. It's a wedging case where China tried to divide the US-South Korea alliance between 2012 and 2018. So in this case, South Korea and United States are allies, and China tries to drive a wedge in this alliance to induce South Korea a little away from the United States because, well, China doesn't like a large US military presence on China's periphery. So China tries to use alliance balancing strategies to achieve that objective. And again, China starts with its leverage. So first, I will argue that in this period, China's leverage largely came from three sources. So the first, the rise of Chinese military power. With a more powerful navy and a more powerful air force, China was able to reshape the strategic environment that South Korea faced in this period. And second, South Korea's economy largely relied on China. So between 2012 and 2018, on average, about 12% of South Korea's GDP relied on its exports to China. So it's pretty high. And again, dependence would create a vulnerability, and that would give China some leverage. And finally, there are some maritime disputes between China and South Korea. So those two countries have disputed exclusive economic zones in East China Sea, and there is a disputed rock between China and South Korea. It's called Eodo Rock, indicated on the map. So those maritime disputes provide China with an opportunity to either reward South Korea by keeping silent on those, or to punish or to threaten South Korea by becoming vocal on those issues.
Those are South Koreans on the.
Yeah, that's the South Koreans. Yeah, it's and the rock is always under the water, so it's not
really a rock.
Yeah, it's not really. Yeah. So it's not really a territory. So it's not even disputed territory. So between 2012 and 2015, the primary strategy that China chose was accommodation. So China increased its economic cooperation with South Korea. Those two governments reached an agreement on the direct currency clearance. Those two governments speed up their negotiations on free trade agreements. And then China kept silent on those maritime disputes. So there were some frictions between China and South Korea. You have the Chinese detaining South Korean fishing boats and the fishermen. You have South Korea detaining Chinese fishing boats and the fishermen, but China didn't make a big deal out of those frictions. And when it comes to the Eodo Rock, the Chinese foreign ministry kept saying the rock was not a territory. So it's not a territory, then it's not definitely not a disputed territory. So that's a commendation towards South Korea from China's perspective. And finally, China cooperated with South Korea and the United States and other countries on some unilateral economic sanctions against North Korea when North Korea tried to test some of the nuclear weapons in this period. So it's a serious issue that matters a lot for South Korea. So China's cooperation was accommodating South Korea on that issue. And then the coercive part of China's strategies was that China made it very clear that the deployment of THAAD missile defense system in South Korea would be a red line that South Korea should not cross. So this is what China's threat on that issue would look like. So China made that pretty clear. And then what happened was that the United States put a large amount of pressure on South Korea to deploy the THAAD missile defense system in South Korea. And from China's perspective, the deployment of THAAD is not just about undermining China's nuclear deterrence. It's also about the United States drawing a line between the United States and China and asking South Korea, are you with us or are you with China? And in 2016, South Korea finally agreed to start the negotiation and the deployment of the THAAD missile defense system. And that is an indication showing that the United States was able to undermine China's leverage over South Korea because South Korea's security still largely depends on the United States, not on China. So, as a result, China's strategies switched to coercion as the primary tool in between 2016 and 2018. Okay, so first, China imposed some economic sanctions against South Korea. Right, the first target was the Lotte Group, the company that provided the land for the THAAD deployment. So you have many Lotte marts were shut down in China, and other South Korean companies such as Samsung, Hyundai, and LG were negatively affected by the Chinese economic sanctions. And more importantly, China raised the tension on the maritime disputes with South Korea. So on the map, you have different countries' air defense identification zones in East China Sea. And the red one marks the Chinese air defense identification zone. And the purple one was the South Korean one. And you can see from the map that those two zones overlap, and both of them cover the disputed rock. So between 2016 and 2018, China started to increase the number of fighters and bombers flying over the disputed rock and flying into South Korea's air defense identification zone. It's a signal that China tried to send to South Korea that China is able to seriously undermine South Korea's security. So that's the coercive part of China's strategy. And then in this period, China still used accommodation as its complementary strategy. So China still cooperated with South Korea and other countries on the North Korean nuclear problem in some cases, not in every case. So again, this case basically fits the theory that I just described. So this is what Chinese cooperation looks like. So the Chinese Foreign Ministry says that North Korea's capability to develop nuclear and missile program shall be curbed. Okay, so this is really the second case. To quickly summarize today's presentation. So we start with the motivation that great powers, including China, use alliance balancing strategies in search of security. But then the research question is, how do they choose particular strategy or particular combination of strategies to achieve that objective? And the two main takeaways for my presentation today would be first, leverage and threat perception determine China's choices of alliance balancing strategies. And second, China often chooses a mix of coercion and accommodation to achieve those strategic objectives. And I will stop here and I look forward to questions and comments.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Maybe we can sit at the table.
Yeah.
For the Q&A, so we can pass
Yeah,
the
yeah.
microphone
Yeah.
between us.
Definitely.
So I'll ask the first question. Just you can stay there.
Okay.
That's fine.
Yeah.
We're both gonna be on camera this way. Yeah, so I have some comments and some questions, and we have a lot of time, which is great. So, you know, a couple of questions that come to mind is China as a nation an exception or not? Because your theory is a general theory of alliance binding and alliance wedge strategies. And then the question that always comes up in a China in the world context is, you know, can you be a generalist and a China specialist? And is China different than other countries in the way it behaves? And then within the China set, there's another controversial aspect of your, well, let me ask that first question this way, that in the contemporary era, there's my good friend at Tsinghua University, Yan Xuetong, who is constantly saying that China needs to build an alliance network in Southeast Asia and in Central Asia and maybe even outside of East Asia to compete with the United States, which has a global network. And he gives a very, very convincing kind of realpolitik argument for why China should do that. but I see his argument widely rejected, saying that's just not the Chinese way. They're not going to do that. It's good IR theory, but it's not actual policy recommendation to the government that is practical, because they're not going to do that, right? So that's why I ask, is China an exception to the general rules about alliances or not? And then the second question within the China set is about China, the PRC as a single unit. Was the Mao era fundamentally different than the post-Mao era? And how much of the tensions in the North Korea case in the 60s was not about seeing the Soviet Union necessarily as a direct adversary yet, although as that period grows, 65 to 70, they certainly start to see it as an adversary. They fight them, right? But the early part of that period, there was an intense competition between the Soviets and the Chinese communists for leadership of the communist movement, which is a little bit different than standard security concerns about invasion, et cetera. It's more about, can you convince third parties around the world that your way is the right way for the communist movement? So those questions came to mind. And then from the IR theory point of view, and you don't have to answer all these now, because I think the presentation was excellent. I just, I read the manuscript, I was confused. I reread the manuscript, I was less confused. And then I heard this and I'm much less confused. So I think that the talk is quite clear, but I'm just thinking what, political scientists are going to do when you present this. They're going to ask you, how do you know someone has leverage? How do you measure leverage? And isn't it tautological if you say the leverage is economic and they use accommodation? Right. But it doesn't have to be, because you can do economic sanctions. But there's a kind of sense in your initial presentation that within alliances, leverage means the other side is really dependent on you economically. And then no, not within a when you're wedging, it looks like economics is important to your argument, right? And then with binding, it looks like security is the real leverage, the threat of abandonment, right? But if security is the leverage in binding, then it's not surprising that security is used as a strategy and it's coercive, right? So it might be, in other words, your IV may be informing your DV. That's always a risk in political science arguments, this endogeneity problem. And the second thing that will come up is, how do you know that one of you say in all cases, there's a combination of coercive and accommodative strategies. And you say one is dominant and the other is complementary, right? Is that the word we're using? Yeah, complementary. So how do you know which is dominant and which is complementary? They're both, in all cases, you have both. So how do you measure it so you know that one is the minor strategy and one is the major strategy? And can you be convincing in that in a way that doesn't just look like you're cooking the books to make your thesis look right and alternative theses look wrong? And I have tons of other questions, but I'll ask them later. I just lay those out for you now and open it up to the audience. And very interesting. And I only wish that the Chinese Foreign Ministry was right when it said we shall curb North Korean nuclear and missile programs.
In some cases,
we shall curb, but they haven't been very well curbed, and and that's on me too. So,
should I answer your questions?
Yeah, no, you can take more than you don't have to answer all of them. Just pick what you like.
Yeah. Thanks. I like all your questions and the comments. I think all of them are great, but I will only answer a few for the sake of the time.
Yeah.
So the first one questioned about whether China is exceptional. Well, the assumption underlying my research, this research project, is that China is a like unit. So China, United States, Russia, the Soviet Union, they are all the same. The only difference is in their military and economic power. So by making that assumption, I would argue that we can extend my theoretical framework to other countries. And that's something that I'm trying to do right now. So one of my collaborators and I are working on a case on American wedge strategies towards India and China right now. So hopefully my theory will still hold in that case. If that's the case, then I think it's probably safe to make an argument that China is not that exceptional in that regard. And when it comes to whether China should have alliances, I would argue that China is not exceptional, but China probably should not go for alliances because, well, the United States needs alliances in East Asia because the United States is far away. So it needs places to project power in that region. But China is right there. China's homeland is there. So China doesn't need alliances to project power in East Asia. And to be honest, all other potential candidates for China's allies, they are not very powerful units. North Korea, Laos, Cambodia, or some Central Asian countries, they are not that powerful. So probably they don't add that much to the aggregated capabilities of potential China's camp. So that's the first one. The second question about the ideological tension between China and the Soviet Union in the North Korea case, I would argue that that's definitely one concern that Chinese leaders, particularly Mao, had in that period. And I would also argue that in that period of time, the Cultural Revolution certainly played a negative role in the bilateral relationship between China and North Korea. But I would argue that leaders in Beijing tried very hard to distance themselves away from the Red Guards. And I would also argue that the North Koreans understood that. So once Kim Il-sung told East German guests that we don't care about the Red Guards, they're just a bunch of kids who don't understand politics. So I would just probably downplay the role of ideology in China's strategic calculation in that case. And for the real political science question about how to measure leverage and how to operationalize primary and complementary strategies, I did got those questions in my peer review comments when I tried to publish my paper in security studies. So on how to operationalize primary and complementary strategies, I would argue that it really depends on whether China devotes more resources to, if China devotes more power resources to increasing the costs of the target state to change its alignment decision. If that's the case, then China's primary strategy would be a coercive. If that's not the case, then China's primary strategy would be accommodative. And in the paper, I have a set of indexes.
Oh, you have measured. Okay.
Yeah, how to measure.
Ian Johnson saying measure, measure, measure.
Yeah, how to measure those variables. And on the how to measure the variable of leverage, I would argue that China gets leverage because China possesses some power resources that the target state desires. So those power resources can be security resources, such as access to some key geographic location, or the role of the real area that China could play.
Yeah.
And so those power resources could also include economic resources. So China could provide military assistance, or China could provide economic assistance to the target state.
So those trenches, right? Just to be on a very specific example.
Yeah.
I know that in Vietnam, which I studied pretty carefully, the Chinese constantly reminded the Vietnamese communists that only they could save North Vietnam from a U.S. ground invasion.
Yeah.
That the Soviets could give them lots of arms, but if the U.S. crossed the 17th parallel, only China could save.
Yeah.
And then in your example with your satellite photos from the United States, which I wonder if the North Koreans had that kind of intel themselves about their own border that the United States had about their border with China in the 1960s. How come that those trenches weren't seen as reassuring the North that the Chinese had sufficient forces near their border to come to their assistance? It must have been the nature that if there's artillery, it will only reach into North Korea, right?
Yeah.
So North Korea saw it as a threat, not as a reassurance.
Yes, definitely. So that part of story definitely applies to this case. And also, I mean, so China started to construct those trenches in late 1968 and early 1969. So it's also part of the defense preparation for the potential Soviet invasion. So China could send a mixed signal to both the Soviets and the North Koreans. And the part of the signal that China sent to the North Koreans probably that don't you dare to let the Soviets use your territory to attack us. Okay. So that's part of my interpretation.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good answer.
Yeah.
All right. Other people.
Thank you, thanks for the presentation. So this is completely out of my expertise. So I have some very abstract questions. Like in series 16, like the actors we have like China, US. For example, in the South Korean case, we have China, US, and South Korea. So think about theory, like you want to explain like China's strategies. So my question is about, do you think China's strategy depend on US strategy? Because it's mirror case, like when China wants to drive an edge, US try to bind like the. So do you think like China's strategy is independent, or China's strategy depends on what China thinks US will do? Because this will like change like your theoretical models. And the second thing, I think mentions like the measurement, I think it's really important. Like it's a empirical question. Like I have a conceptual question about like measurement. For example, when you're talking about leverage, is that the absolute leverage China has over like South Korea, or it's a relative leverage like China compared to US against like South Korea? Because like, it's a competition of so China US competes to gain like South Korean to our side. So when you're talking about leverage, is that a relative leverage or absolute leverage? Thanks.
Bring that back. Thanks. Now we can answer.
Yeah, and give me some time to think about the questions. Thanks for your two great questions. And so on your first question about whether China's choices of strategies depends on the US potential countermeasures or the Soviet countermeasures, I would argue that definitely that's the case. So when China, so especially I try to describe a dynamic. So it's an interaction among China, the United States, or the adversary and the target state, the South Korea. So in that process, the Chinese leaders need to consistently consider what potential US countermeasures would look like. And so that's definitely comes into Chinese leaders' calculations. And that answer also is related to your second question. It's about how to measure leverage, whether it's an absolute or relative one. So I would definitely argue that leverage is a relative concept. So when I talk about China's leverage, it's always about China's relative leverage over North Korea vis-a-vis the Soviet leverage. So for example, in my presentation, when we discussed about North Korea, I said that it's difficult for the Soviet Union to provide a substitute for China's leverage because of the short border between China and the Soviet Union. In that case, China had a strong leverage over North Korea. But if that's not the case, if the border between China and North Korea and the one between the Soviet Union and North Korea were basically the same amount, then China didn't have a strong leverage. Or if China's leverage over North Korea came from China's ability to provide military hardware, then China didn't have a strong leverage because the Soviet Union had way better military hardware ready for the North Koreans. And I said this is related to the first question because when China considers its strategies and the potential countermeasures from the adversary's strategies can affect China's leverage or the adversary's leverage over the target state. So that's why they all come into play, and that's why all those countries' strategic choices interact with one another. Hopefully that's my answer. Clear enough.
We have a good question online from Ian Johnson, if you want to.
Yeah.
The question online from Ian Johnson.
This is great talk, Chengzhi. I hope you are interested. I know you are interested in general rationalist explanations, but what are the best alternative explanations for the patterns you observe in your DV, and why are they wrong?
Thanks for that great question, and it's a tough one. So, in my different cases, I deal with all kinds of alternative explanations. So, for example, in my South Korea case, the most powerful alternative explanation would come from Tim Crawford. That is, a great power always prefers selective accommodation when driving a wedge, unless that state doesn't have sufficient capabilities to use selective accommodation for a wedge. So my criticism against that alternative explanation would be that if Tim Crawford's explanation holds, then we should see that China continues to consistently uses accommodation or coercion across two different periods towards South Korea when trying to drive a wedge between South Korea and the United States. If his argument holds, because China is rising in that period, but China still less powerful than the United States in the entire period. So if that's the case, then China's wedge strategy towards South Korea should stay the same in the first period and in the second period. And the alternative explanation for my North Korea case would be an argument from Izumi, a Japanese scholar who does a lot of work on binding strategies. And his argument would be that China's binding strategies would depend on China's reward power over North Korea. And again, my criticism would be that in the North Korea case, China's reward power over North Korea kind of stayed the same. And China had a superior reward power towards North Korea. If Izumi-Kawa's theory works, then we should observe China applying accommodative binding strategies towards North Korea, because his argument would be that accommodation can avoid the risk of balancing blowback. And if China has strong reward power, then China definitely should go for accommodation. But in my case, it shows that China had strong reward power over North Korea, but China chose coercion as its primary strategy. And my overarching criticism against Izumi-Kawa and Crawford's arguments would be that their theories don't really consider mixed strategies. And as my cases show, that China often mix accommodation and coercion in those cases.
Oh, so let me pile on there. I don't know if there's more questions online, but I wonder about the category of reward and coercion. You know, I studied not in this classroom, but one exactly like it with David Baldwin when I was a Columbia grad student, and he always pointed out that you know, that promises and threats are often two sides of the same coin. So the economic leverage that provides the ability to reward also provides the ability to punish.
Yeah.
And why isn't it just the case that, you know, they tried rewards, it didn't work, and it's all about economics. So what was the carrot becomes the frozen carrot, which becomes the stick. And that looks a little bit like what happened between China and South Korea.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if that really runs against what you're saying or not, but I do think that there's this kind of sense of threat of punishment, and which is usually in the security realm, and reward in the economic realm.
Yeah.
But you do have cases in your presentation today. You do show that reward can be a security reward.
Yeah.
And sanctions can be a threat as well. So maybe you've already answered that. So I apologize if it's already answered.
No. And to add to that, so there's another potential alternative explanation for all my cases. That is, China starts with one strategy, it doesn't work out, then China switches to another. Then the potential pushback from me would be that at that critical juncture, China actually faces two options. One is to switch to a different tool, from accommodation to coercion, or from coercion to accommodation, or the other option China can choose is to increase its efforts on accommodation or coercion.
Right.
So that's always the trade-off that China needs to consider. And I would argue that my cases show that those two independent variables affect China's choices.
So how would you code a diplomatic exchange in which the statement was made, we have a really good economic relationship. I hope we can maintain the environment for that.
Okay, so that would be
I've heard that a few times.
yes, that's very true. And I would put that into the category of accommodation, but it's a very cheap one because talk is kind of.
All right, so I'm from New York City, right? No, I'm
Mhm.
from New York. He's
Oh.
from New York City. Ike is from New York City. I'm only from New York, right? So when mobsters approach small businesses,
Mhm.
they say, you have a really nice business.
Okay.
I really like to see it continue.
Okay.
And that's usually considered a threat.
Yeah, I agree.
Like, in order to have the conditions necessary for this nice business to continue, you need to cooperate with me.
Yeah.
So if China says to South Korea, Lotte is doing really well in China.
Yeah.
And, the whole Beijing taxi fleet or Hyundais, that's just a great situation. And, this Thad thing is kind of complicated, and I'd hate to see the economic relationship influenced by the Thad thing. Is that a threat or is that a promise?
Well, you should.
To me, it sounds like a threat because I'm from New York. I worked in construction in New York. I heard things like this,
Yeah, in that case, I agree that it sounds like a threat because when you try to code China's statements, because in many cases, China tried to put their statements in a very subtle and implicit words.
Mhm.
You should definitely put that into the broader context to decide whether to code that as a threat or a accommodation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mhm.
It's just taking the face value of the words is just not the way to go.
Stephanie has a question. Get her to the microphone and then we'll give it back.
Thanks. Great.
No high tech here.
So yeah, thanks so much for the presentation. I have a few questions. I know we talked a lot about leverage, so I was wondering if you could talk about your other independent variable of threat perception, which often think of as capabilities and intentions. In the North Korea case, maybe it was more about intentions that were being signaled. In the South Korea case, was it more about the capabilities from that? I would just like to hear a little bit about how you kind of define the threat perception, especially with the change in South Korea. My second question is kind of linked to the South Korea case. So not just the mix of coercion and accommodation, but can your theory explain which areas China decides to coerce and accommodate on? Because in some ways, South Korea was motivated to bring in THAAD because of the North Korean threat. So do you think China was accommodating on North Korea while coercing on the other issues in order to try and push against that? Or is that just a function of China's power in these relative areas? And they could have easily decided to coerce South Korea by letting North Korea, encouraging proliferation by North Korea, but not sanctioning South Korea. So just kind of pushing a little bit more on like which issue areas China decides to operate on. And then my last question is just out of curiosity, thinking about this idea of the theory as generalizable. And China doesn't have a lot of formal alliances, as we were saying. So in terms of the binding cases, other than North Korea, are there sort of contemporary security cooperations, examples that you think this applies pretty well to? I know you mentioned Laos and Cambodia kind of briefly, but maybe Pakistan, yeah. And I don't know, maybe we're entering into an area with Russia. But yeah, I was just curious if you could talk about cooperation short of what Americans are used to, which is a very formal alliance.
Thanks for your questions, or great questions. So the first one about the how to define threat perception. So I would argue it's a function of both intention and capabilities. So in the North Korea case, the power of North Korea or the balance of power among China, the Soviet Union, and North Korea didn't change that much in that case. But the intention that North Korea had to drift away a little bit from China to the Soviet Union posed a threat to China, because the Soviet Union was the threat for China, and then North Korea drifting away just made the Soviet camp more powerful than the Chinese one. And as for the South Korea case, then, as I mentioned, the major source of threat that China perceived in that case is about the tightness of this US-South Korea alliance. It's already a pretty cohesive alliance, but when the United States tried very hard to put a THAAD within South Korea, that's a next level. And the United States also hinted its interest to have this trilateral military defense network among the United States, South Korea, and Japan. That's definitely something that China did not want to have in its own region. So it's both, in that case, it will be both capabilities and intention. And the second question about South Korea case, about which issue areas to coerce, which issue areas to accommodate, that's a great question, and I don't have a generalizable answer to that question. But for the for the South Korea case specifically, I would argue that China chose to accommodate South Korea on the North Korean nuclear weapons problem, partly because in the first place, in 2016, after North Korea conducted its fourth nuclear test, China failed to effectively respond to that test. So there was this military hotline between Seoul and Beijing, and immediately after North Korea's nuclear test in 2016, South Korea tried to ring the phone, but
No one ever answers.
Yeah. And it took the Chinese about 1 week or 2 weeks to figure out the answer, and then they picked up the phone. So that's on the Chinese fault. So I would argue that's partly explain why China decided to accommodate South Korea in that issue area. I'm not entirely sure whether that's true, but
It's probably true because it's a function. It's a function of the way the Chinese deal with this type of communication device.
yeah.
If the issue is really important, they don't answer. If the issue is less important, they will. And it has to do with the authority of the person answering.
Yeah.
You know, can that person really answer and give a detailed response when they don't even know what the question is yet?
Yeah.
And it's a very, because the more important the issue, the less likely it is to work, which is the counter of what you want in a hotline. You want it to be ready when it's the most important issue, but it tends to be the inverse.
Yeah.
I say something about that is that here's an alternative explanation that you should probably wrestle with, because you dealt with half of the alternative explanation, which is that the PRC was very concerned that THAAD would become the pretext for a unified US, Japan, South Korea trilateral alliance, something that China has tried to prevent. And it's pretty easy to prevent, as Stephanie knows, because of the historical hostilities between South Korea and Japan. So when they get closer together, it looks artificially weird to a lot of observers, including PRC observers. Like, things are going really bad if the South Koreans and the Japanese look like they're going to get together. And THAAD, for technological reasons, tends to bring them together because of the nature of exoatmospheric intercept of missiles, and the technologies involved in that. It would naturally bring countries together who were involved in the theater missile defense system. So I can see them being really upset about that for that reason, and therefore wanting to pressure South Korea. But I could also see them at the same time being really upset with North Korea for bringing around the conditions that were so hostile to the United States and to
Mhm.
South Korea that it would bring South Korea and Japan together,
Mhm.
which is an unnatural outcome that only North Korea could create. So maybe the pressure on North Korea to the degree it actually existed, these new UN Security Council resolutions during the Obama administration,
Mhm.
maybe that accommodation to South Korea wasn't really about South Korea, reassuring South Korea. It was about actually punishing North Korea, trying to get them to stop doing things that brought South Korea and Japan together.
Okay.
That's just an alternative.
Thanks for the alternative explanation. I will definitely wrestle with that when I continue revising my
We
manuscript.
need to answer everything. I
Yeah.
think Ike has a question. So I hand you go half up. Yeah. So let's get on the mic.
You want to respond to that first?
I think I have
You can write it down.
I have additional response to Stephanie's question
Okay.
about the alignments.
Okay, then we'll give the.
Yeah, cases. So I do have other cases of alignments that China has with other countries in which China considers binding strategies. So first one would be the alignment between China and the North Vietnam in the Vietnam War. So they didn't have an alliance agreement, but it's
Yeah.
basically a security alignment between those two countries.
Yeah.
And I would argue that in the 2010s, there is somewhat security alignment or cooperation between China and North Korea. Not at a very high level, but it exists to some extent. So we do have those cases, and that's also why I try to use alignment in my definition, not alliance, because that will allow me to cover more cases. And
Now, Ike, yeah, give it to Ike. Here we go.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. This is, again, slightly outside my area. So I would, from a historian's vantage point, like to show a reflection, which is, it seems unnatural to take these cases out of historical context without considering what came immediately before and what came after. In other words, I'm sure this is more in your book, but I would like to know what were the conditions prior to 1965 in the China-North Korea relationship, and what was the nature of the change, the deviation from baseline? Because if the 1965 status quo ex ante was idiosyncratic in the longer term historical relationship between those two countries, you could get something that looks like reversion to, that actually is reversion to the mean, but that you are presenting as a distinctive case. In other words, what are the historical conditions that trigger China or any state to decide that it wants to undertake a wedging or a binding initiative? Why is China not doing this all the time, trying to wedge all American alliances in the region relentlessly, pursuing the same strategies in every country or alternating between them? Why hasn't there been
I would argue that China doesn't like this US-South Korea alliance all from the very beginning. But in this book project, I start with 2012 because I was trying to control the variable of Chinese domestic politics, because that's after Xi Jinping took office in China. So I try to control that variable to increase the explanatory power or the generalizability of my theory. So that's why I start that case with 2012. But I would argue that adding more historical background to that case would help. I will consider that and try to work on that part. And the second question about those contemporary cases, such as US-Taiwan case and the US-Australia case, to be honest, I haven't really thought through over all those cases, but I'm a little reluctant to apply my theory to the US-Taiwan case because it's probably an overdetermined case for my theory, because it's not just about driving from China's perspective. It's not just about driving a wedge between Taiwan and the United States. It's also about unification. It's also about the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party regime. It's also about nationalism. It's about this national rejuvenation grand design. All those variables come into play. I'm a little reluctant to apply my theory to that case. And for the the Philippine case under the Duterte period, I would argue that it fits my theory because under the Duterte administration, China largely relied on accommodation. So China increased economic cooperation with the Philippines. China did not become very vocal on South China Sea disputes under the Duterte administration. So that's accommodation. And because China had strong leverage over the Philippines under the, well, strong probably is a too strong phrase, moderate too strong leverage over the Philippines under the Duterte administration. And that would explain China's choice of accommodation towards the Philippines. And for the Australian case, I mean, it's questionable whether this US-Australia alliance really poses an imminent threat to China's security. So there will be a big question mark over that question. So I'm not sure whether China perceives that alliance as a serious and imminent threat to China's security right now. So probably that can hardly explain China's strategies. But I haven't really thought about that case.
So let me say one thing, but I'm gonna have to leave. That's why I'm being rude. First of all, I'm being rude. I'm eating before everybody else because I have to go teach in Steve Biddle's class. I volunteered to teach an extra class. So, but on this particular thing of strategy, this is where your very realist Robert Ross approach to international politics is going to come under criticism from China specialists, right? And it's right on this Australia case, because the reason Australia is being sanctioned is not for AUKUS and its closeness to the US alliance system. The reason that Australia is being sanctioned is that Australia demanded a transparent multilateral investigation of China's treatment of COVID.
Yeah.
So it's about the real security risk in Beijing, which is not about the national interest of China, but the interest of the Chinese Communist Party and its reputation for good governance at home and its legitimacy at home. And that's a different type of security. And I think people are going to raise that with you, that you have too much of a national view and not enough of a domestic security view for the regime. And I'll just say that, and then I'm going to eat rudely, and then I'm going to run off, and Daniel will take over the session.
So you had a
Yeah, go ahead.
you
So maybe I can make them. Anyone listening? Yes.
Thanks. Everyone on Zoom who can hear this one. So thank you. I think that was very helpful. I was a bit confused though about your response on the Australia case, because what seems to me that this is a case study of, Australia is, it is a regional middle power. It is aligned with the United States. The relationship between the two is deepening. Tick, tick, tick seems to meet the criteria for a wedging strategy to apply. If, as I think I hear from you, you're saying, no, wedging strategies are only like there's an additional criterion, which is unstated, which it has to rise to a level of significance, geostrategic significance or what have you, that it's considered worthwhile to adopt one of these strategies. And if not, accommodation and coercion happens all the time at the baseline, but that doesn't rise to the stature of being a decision to we're going to try binding or we're going to try wedging. If that's the case, then I'd be curious to hear more about the conditional criteria that you think have to be met for wedging or binding to be defined. Maybe I'm sure you have that in the book. You didn't want to waste our time in the talk, but I'm curious about because if you take a very broad definition of it, you can see it kind of happening relentlessly all the time. So you have to be a bit restrictive in terms of your case selection. And then for Taiwan, sure, I completely accept the explanation that it's a special case, but then you also have to have a list of exceptions. So I'm curious if there are other exceptional cases for various reasons that we might not be thinking of that are relevant. Or, for example, if we wanted to think about Russia's relationship to Ukraine in the 5 years leading up to the invasion, right? Ukraine was seeking an understanding with the West. Russia pursued various policies, ultimately decided to invade, but Russia had a view of Ukraine that is in some ways similar to China's view of Taiwan. So, what are the criteria, be they related to domestic politics or something else, that would disqualify cases from consideration under your typology?
Thanks for your follow-up questions. I think they raise some interesting and important points about my case selections and theory. So the first one about the criteria or the standard beyond which China would start to consider use alliance balancing strategies would be that I would argue that so the major threat for China comes from the adversary, and the target's alignment or potential alignment with the adversary just contributes to the adversary's threat to China. So if that part of the equation starts to change, that's when China needs to change its strategies. If that alignment from the very beginning adds the adversary's threat to China, then China would from the very beginning starts to consider using alliance balancing strategies. So, for example, I have another case in my book manuscript. It's about China's wedge strategies towards the United States and Thailand during the Vietnam War. Okay? So the US-Thailand alliance existed way before the Vietnam War, but after the war started, Thailand contributed to the US war efforts in Vietnam. That's when China started to use alliance balancing strategies towards Thailand, not from the very beginning, not from the very first day of this US-Thailand alliance. So I would argue that there must be some standards and criteria, and you need to meet those criteria in order for China to start considering the use of alliance balancing strategies. And that's part of the reason why I said the US-Australia case is a little tricky, because on the one hand, this case kind of fits my theory. So China tries to drive a wedge into this US-Australia alliance. China doesn't have a strong leverage over Australia because Australia is far away. So China uses coercion against Australia. But then the question is whether China perceived a serious threat from this US-Australia alliance. So that's where I need to do more research on. So in order to figure out what Chinese leaders really think about this US-Australia alliance. So that's why I cannot give you a definitive answer right away for now.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chenji.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. And what's your final question about changes? I have change in threats, but I forgot your exact question.
Yeah, you basically, you hit on it. It is what is the change?
Okay, yeah.
that take place? What is the nature of the shift from baseline and like what are the definition and criteria?
The question is what kind of change from baseline is required to initiate a wedging strategy or a binding strategy, and what are the what would define a special case? And I think you touched on both aspects of the question.
Yeah. So yeah, I agree that China considers its alliance balancing strategies when it considers the overarching balance of power between China and the adversary or among China, the adversary and the target. So when China thinks that balance of power shifts in a unfavored way from China's perspective, that's when China starts to consider the use of alliance balancing strategies. And there are many special cases, and I would definitely treat the US-Taiwan case as a special case because on the one hand, if you believe that when China says it has special treatments to Taiwanese business interests or to Taiwanese people, then I would argue that China adopts a balanced mix of coercion and accommodation towards Taiwan. So that's partly fits my theory. But if you think that's just a sugar-coated propaganda, China really tries to exert pressure on Taiwan, then it's a special case and it's an outlier for my case and for my theory. And then I need to come up with a different explanation for that case.
Sorry, one more comment.
One more comment about that point, which I'm sure you get into in your book, is, you know, how many units of economic leverage or coercion are worth 1 unit of military coercion?
Mm-hmm.
Like when you're comparing across issue categories, it gets kind of arbitrary or difficult to code. And I can imagine historians or regional, country experts looking at the same fact pattern and saying, no, actually, this one mattered more. And you have to go into the weeds of domestic political context. Who needs what? Who cares about what? Perception of risk. And even when you do, it's a thorny qualitative debate to try to stack up, economic and military stuff on either side of the ledger and figure out which matters more.
Yeah, I definitely agree with your comment, and I think it's unavoidable. So when it comes to your detailed case studies, at a certain point, you have to become arbitrary in terms of how to decide whether 1 unit of military power is more important or 1 unit of economic power is more important. And really, it depends on the specific context of each case to see which domestic group plays the dominant role in that society and what kind of interests or values they have for certain foreign policies or domestic policies. And then you can decide whether China uses more military or economic power or resources to affect that part of the calculation. It's to some extent arbitrary, I would admit that, and I will wrestle with that in more details in the future. Yeah, thanks.
So we're getting close to time, it's a little after 6. I have one last question online, and then maybe if there's any further questions here, we can discuss them over dinner.
Yeah.
So the last question online, what are your thoughts about the August 1956 incident and how it may have colored China's later alliance building approach to the DPRK? And I assume that they are in reference to the August faction incident of 1956. Are you familiar with this?
Which year?
1956?
56. Yeah. Great question. But unfortunately, I would argue that 1956 case is kind of irrelevant to my case study here, because that incident was about North Korea, or Kim Il-sung tried to purge pro-Chinese faction within North Korea. And that happened before North Korea became a formal ally of both China and the Soviet Union. So I would argue that incident indicated North Korean leaders' efforts or attempts to get rid of the influence of China or any external force. So it's not about switching as loyalty or alignment decision between China and the Soviet Union. So I would argue that that's an important historical incident, but it's not particularly relevant to my case study here. And I would argue that my theory probably has no explanatory power on the causes or the consequences or implications of that incident in my research project. Thanks.
All right. Well, with that, I'm going to close out the session. So thank you everyone for staying. Wonderful talk. I don't want to talk about this, but our last talk of the semester is next Monday with Xiaoming Wang in this same classroom at 4:30. So we'll see you then. Thanks so much.